Welcome TP, the series of driftaway tales. This is your time to rest, to breathe deeply, and to drift gently into peaceful sleep. Close your eyes, let go of the day, and allow this calm story to carry you softly into dreams. If you like these stories, please like the video and subscribe the channel. Chapter 1. The Luncheon at Brindleford Hall. The late September sun gilded Brindleford Hall, turning ivy to bronze and gravel to gold. Inside, the house stirred with quiet precision, silver polished, flowers arranged, servants moving briskly. Lady Eleanor Fortescue's annual autumn luncheon was the village's most anticipated ritual. Below, the village of Brindleford basked in calm. At the bakery, Mrs. Partridge declared, "It's the grandest affair of the year. Even the vicar dusts off his best cassock." Mrs. Grant sniffed, "And the colonel always attends, strutting like a general. Lucky she still invites him, after all that gossip about her late husband." "Can't very well leave him out," said Mrs. Partridge. "He was the husband's oldest friend." "Yes," came the dry reply, "and not a friend he trusted much." By noon, the first carriages crunched up the drive. Lady Fortescue, tall, imperious, 72, and splendidly composed, stood beneath the marble arch to greet her guests. "Mrs. Blythe, such loyalty. And Miss Marple, we've heard of your extraordinary mind, all the way from St. Mary Mead." Miss Marple, neat in dove gray, smiled gently. "I'm sure that's exaggerated. Human nature is the same everywhere. Only the teapots differ." A ripple of polite laughter followed as the guests gathered in the drawing room. Colonel Reginald Archer, red-faced and booming. Charlotte Fortescue, Lady Eleanor's restless niece, in green silk. The vicar and his wife, and Mrs. Cummings, the housekeeper, hovering dutifully near the door. At luncheon, the long table shimmered with crystal and silver. Conversation ambled between weather and village. Gossip until the colonel's voice broke through. "Fine day for the Riviera. Finer company there, though." "Indeed," said Lady Fortescue coolly. "Memory must serve where manners fail." A faint smile from Miss Marple, a delicate cough from the vicar, and the unease passed. Though Lady Fortescue's mouth tightened, she was enduring, not enjoying. When dessert plates vanished, the butler brought the port. The colonel raised his glass theatrically. Two absent friends, and those lucky enough to remain beneath Lady Fortescue's roof, for what it's worth. A ripple of uneasy laughter drifted round the table. Then, silence. The colonel lifted his glass and froze. His color drained. The glass slipped, shattering on the floor. Charlotte screamed. Mrs. Cummings darted forward. Miss Marple rose at once, her eyes calm. One glance was enough. "It won't help," she said softly. "He's gone." Within the hour, the drawing room had changed from genteel civility to dread. The colonel's body lay upstairs. Servants whispered. Lady Fortescue sat rigid, pale, but proud. Dr. Miles arrived, examined the remains, and said, grimly, "Poison, fast-acting, poison." Lady Fortescue's tone was icy. "In my house. Likely in the wine or port," said the doctor. Miss Marple, quiet by the window, asked gently, "Did he always use the same glass?" "Yes," said the doctor, puzzled. "Then," she murmured, "perhaps we might begin there." By evening, Inspector Reeves from Exeter took charge, a compact, skeptical man who spoke in clipped notes. "Doctor says, strychnine." "Who poured the port?" "I did, sir," said the butler, trembling. "I poured for everyone." But the colonel changed his glass, said his was too small, and took Miss Fortescue's instead. All eyes turned to Charlotte. "I never touched mine," she stammered. Reeves nodded. We'll need the decanter and all glasses. He eyed Miss Marple. You were present, madam. Yes, she said mildly. It was most unfortunate, though, perhaps not entirely unexpected. Oh, he said. And why's that? The colonel was a man with too many enemies and too few apologies, she said. When one makes a habit of cruelty, someone eventually objects. The inspector's pencil paused. You've a sharp sense for character. Only for repetition, Miss Marple replied. People seldom invent new vices. Night closed over Brindleford Hall like a curtain. The guests were confined to their rooms. The servants whispered in corners. Miss Marple, serene in the small guest parlor, sipped tea by the fire and considered the day's performance. Poison implied planning. Planning implied motive. Lady Fortescue, humiliated before her guests, perhaps furious. Charlotte, nervous, secretive, possibly afraid. Mrs. Cummings, loyal, yet bitter, and in charge of the household wine. Her gaze lingered on the sealed decanter, its crimson depths flickering in firelight. Wine, she murmured, the color of pride and sin. They so often pour together. Folding her knitting, she smiled faintly. The first act was done. The play of truth had only just begun. Chapter 2. The Village in Shock. Morning came gray and thin, the kind of English dawn that drains color from the hedgerows and gossip alike. Yet gossip thrived. By breakfast, all Brindleford knew Colonel Archer was dead, poisoned at Lady Fortescue's luncheon. At the post office, Mrs. Partridge declared, I always said he'd come to a bad end. A man can't insult people forever. Mr. Huggins grunted. He had it coming. Half the village owed him something. If not poison, a brick through the window would have done it. Every theory blamed someone else. The colonel's reputation lasted less than a day beyond his life. At the hall, Lady Fortescue ruled her household like a general, under siege, dignified in mourning gray, unmoved by the chaos of reporters and police. My dear Miss Marple, she said, when the old lady called, how singularly unpleasant this is. Inspector Reeves thinks one of my guests is guilty. He's even questioned poor Charlotte. Absurd. Fear, Miss Marple replied gently, can make the foolish quite clever. You think Charlotte knows something. I think everyone knows something, Miss Marple said. They simply prefer not to admit it. Inspector Reeves entered, boots dusty from the fields. Labs confirmed strychnine in the port. Strong dose, quick death, he reported. Then deliberate, said Lady Fortescue. Certainly, servants are mostly cleared, except Mrs. Cummings. She was in the pantry when the glasses were taken out, Miss Marple recalled. Reeves studied her. You notice everything, don't you? I've found household routines reveal far more than people think, she said. Loyalty is a fragile thing in large houses. Reeves frowned. The niece, Charlotte. She's hiding something. Most young women are, Miss Marple said mildly. But the ones who shout their innocence are seldom the innocent ones. Charlotte's distress. Miss Marple later found Charlotte in the conservatory, weeping quietly. I can't bear it, she said. They all look at me as though I did it. I hardly remember what happened. Fear blurs time, Miss Marple said kindly. Tell me, why didn't you drink your port? I never do. Uncle teased me, said I wasn't grown up. Then he took my glass instead. I didn't think. Did you notice anyone near the decanter? Only Mrs. Cummings. She was shaking so badly I feared she'd drop it. Miss Marple nodded. You were fond of your uncle. Charlotte hesitated. Sometimes, but he frightened me. He knew everyone's secrets. He said if I married without his consent, He'd cut me off. He even knew about— She stopped, blushing. About what, my dear? It doesn't matter. Miss Marple smiled. Things we think over have a way of coming back like unpaid bills. Charlotte gave a weak laugh. You don't think I did it? My dear child, Miss Marple said, patting her hand, you'd have used a hairpin, not poison. Later, Miss Marple found the housekeeper polishing silver, her movements tense. I suppose the inspector's been questioning you. Yes, ma'am, I've told him what I know. I didn't touch the decanter. Mr. Forbes poured the port. I only fetched napkins. The Colonel was not kind to you, Miss Marple said softly. Mrs. Cummings froze. He ruined my boy, called him a thief, cost him his post. The lad never recovered. I'm sorry, said Miss Marple, but you'd tell the truth, even at a cost. Truth's cheap, ma'am, said the woman bitterly. It's justice that costs. Their eyes met. Miss Marple saw not guilt, but a wound still raw after years of pride and pain. The next day, the village lay hushed. The Colonel's coffin rested in the church. Curtains were drawn. Yet curiosity soon revived. At the grocer's, speculation bloomed. Mark my words, said Mr. Huggins. It's that niece, silk, perfume, and trouble. Nonsense, sniffed Mrs. Partridge. It's the housekeeper. They always know too much. Miss Marple took her morning walk through this web of whispers, pausing by the fresh grave. Such neat order, she murmured. If only morality were as simple to keep tidy. At the church gate, she met Inspector Reeves. Morning, Miss Marple, you're early. I think best in fresh air, she said. Any progress? Too many motives, no proof. The man was universally hated. If dislike were evidence, I'd arrest half of Devon. Miss Marple smiled. Hatred's common, Inspector, but affection is rarer, and often more dangerous. I think your clue lies there. He frowned. Affection. Someone killed him not because they hated him, she said quietly, but because once they cared too much, and with that she left him staring after her. That night, mist crept over the fields as Miss Marple sat by her window. The house slept uneasily. She knitted her mind as calm and methodical as her hands. Two things were certain. First, the killing was planned, but clumsily, not the work of a practiced poisoner. Second, someone in the house was protecting someone else. The air was thick with silent defense, like lavender lingering after a door closes. She set her knitting aside and smiled faintly. People kill for money, yes, she murmured. But far more often, they kill for love. And love, in my experience, is the deadliest poison of all. Outside, the mist thickened around Brindleford Hall, wrapping the village in quiet, uneasy sleep. Chapter 3. The following morning dawned bright but cold, the sort of autumn day that looked cheerful from a window and less so when one stepped outside. Miss Marple, wrapped in her warmest shawl, descended to breakfast to find Lady Fortescue already seated at the table, reading the newspaper with the stiff dignity of one refusing to notice scandal. The servants moved about softly. The silver gleamed. The toast rack was full, and yet there was that odd stillness, a silence that wasn't peace, but caution. Everyone in the house had begun to measure their words. You slept well, I hope, Lady Fortescue said without looking up. Quite well, thank you, Miss Marple replied, though I dreamed of decanters, which I suppose is inevitable. Lady Fortescue's lips thinned. The inspector intends to return this afternoon. He says the coroner will open the inquest tomorrow. It is a dreadful business. Yes, Miss Marple agreed gently. But dreadful business often reveals interesting people. The older woman gave her a sharp glance. You make it sound almost entertaining. Oh, not at all, but I've found that character is most clearly seen when people are frightened. It's like shaking a jar. The sediment always rises. Lady Fortescue folded her paper. I have no interest in people's sediment, Miss Marple. I want the matter closed. So does the murderer, I imagine, said Miss Marple softly. The butler, entering at that moment with more coffee, nearly dropped the pot. Later that morning, Miss Marple walked out toward the gardens. The air smelled faintly of wet leaves, and the gravel crunched beneath her feet. The scene of the luncheon looked almost innocent again, the long table dismantled, the chairs neatly stacked, the only trace of tragedy the faint stain where the Colonel's glass had shattered. She bent slightly, her sharp eyes noting a few small fragments of glass glinting between the flagstones. She knelt, examined them, and noticed something curious, a pale residue clinging to the rim, faint but distinct. Powdered, not dissolved, she murmured. Then it wasn't mixed beforehand. A movement behind her made her turn. Charlotte Fortescue stood a few yards away, her coat hastily buttoned, a look of guilt she didn't seem to understand herself. Oh, Miss Marple, Ella didn't see you there. Few people do, Miss Marple said pleasantly. You were looking for something. Charlotte hesitated. Only my brooch. I think I lost it that day. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Yes, people do lose things at awkward moments. But I dare say what we lose says as much as what we keep. The girl flushed. You don't trust me, do you? I try not to trust anyone until I've reason to, said Miss Marple. Trust is like teats best brewed slowly. Charlotte gave a small, nervous laugh and bent as if to search the ground again. Miss Marple watched her, noting the tension in her movements, the way she avoided looking toward the terrace door. When Charlotte finally gave up and turned to leave, Miss Marple said quietly, If I were you, my dear, I should stop trying to remember what you dropped that day, and start remembering what you heard. Charlotte paused, startled. What I heard? Yes, Miss Marple said. Sometimes words are more revealing than objects. The girl looked at her uncertainly, then hurried away toward the house. The afternoon brought Inspector Reeves back to the hall. He was in no better humor than before. His boots were muddy, his coat unbuttoned, and his expression announced that the investigation was proceeding precisely nowhere. Too many suspects, Miss Marple, he said as he joined her in the small morning room where she'd taken refuge with her knitting. Every servant's got a grievance, every guest had an argument, and every villager claims to know who did it. Then it's all quite normal, Miss Marple said mildly. You're halfway there. He gave her a resigned look. The coroner'll want facts, not philosophies. All I've got is that the Colonel had enemies. And that's like saying water's wet. Miss Marple set down her knitting. Enemies are dull, Inspector. I should look instead for someone who admired him. Admired him. Reeves blinked. He wasn't exactly lovable. Precisely, said Miss Marple. When people despise a man, they gossip. When they admire him against their better judgment, they keep silent. Silence is much more suspicious. Reeves frowned, half skeptical, but listening now. You've something particular in mind. Only an observation. Mrs. Cummings speaks of the Colonel with hatred, but her eyes are full of fear. Lady Fortescue despises him but is ashamed to say why. And Charlotte, well, her silence is all confusion. But there is someone who neither speaks nor avoids the subject. Who's that? The vicar, Miss Marple said softly. He said nothing at all. Reeves scribbled a note. You think the vicar's involved? Oh no, Inspector, Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling. "But I think he knows something about forgiveness, and that's usually where sin leaves its trace." As the day faded into evening, a thin mist crept up from the woods. Miss Marple, restless, went for a walk through the lower gardens. The air was cold, and somewhere far off, an owl hooted. Halfway down the path, she saw a light glimmering through the trees. A lantern. Moving closer, she found Mrs. Cummings standing near the greenhouse, the light trembling in her hand. "My dear," said Miss Marple gently, "you'll catch your death wandering about at this hour." The housekeeper started. "Oh, I was only making sure the windows were fastened. There's been talk of tramps." "Tramps seldom pick locked greenhouses," Miss Marple said, "and never by lamplight." Mrs. Cummings gave a short, bitter laugh. "You've a sharp tongue for a church lady." "I found it useful," Miss Marple replied, "especially when people mistake kindness for blindness." The woman looked at her for a long moment, then sighed. "I can't sleep, that's all. Every time I close my eyes I see him lying there. And I remember what he said to me that morning." "What did he say?" "He told me he'd see my boy ruined again if I didn't keep my place." Her voice cracked. "And I told him he'd be sorry for it one day." Miss Marple's tone was very soft. "Words said in anger are like matches, Mrs. Cummings. One never knows what they might set alight." Mrs. Cummings turned away, the lantern glow flickering on her face. "I didn't kill him, Miss Marple. God help me, I didn't. But I'm not sorry he's gone." "No," Miss Marple said quietly. "I dare say many people aren't." The woman walked away into the mist. Miss Marple stood a moment longer, thoughtful. Then she noticed something on the ground near the greenhouse door. A small square of folded paper, damp from the grass. She stooped and picked it up. The writing on it, though smudged, was legible. "Meet me in the library after luncheon. No one else must know." It was signed with the initials H.B. Miss Marple smiled faintly in the dim light. "How interesting," she murmured. "A meeting never kept, and a secret never confessed. How very like human nature." She folded the note carefully and slipped it into her pocket. The mist thickened around her as she made her way back to the house, the soft light from its windows glowing like islands in the fog. By the time she reached her room, she knew what she would do next. She would pay a quiet visit to the vicarage in the morning, for whatever else might be false in Brindleford. Miss Marple had learned that the vicar's conscience, and perhaps his handwriting, would not be. Chapter 4. The Vicar's Secret. Morning light filtered softly through the mist, turning the lawns of Brindleford Hall into silver veils. Miss Marple rose early, had her tea by the window, and watched a gardener sweeping the gravel path as though each stroke might erase the memory of murder. By the time the church bells struck 9, she had made up her mind to visit the vicarage. The vicarage stood at the edge of the village, shaded by a row of chestnut trees. It was a pleasant house, a little shabby, a little proud, with ivy creeping up one side, and a garden that looked both tended and neglected, as if the person who kept it had good intentions and too little time. Miss Marple was shown into the sitting room by a housemaid, who informed her that the Reverend Henry Blythe was just finishing his sermon notes. He appeared moments later, a mild, courteous man in his 50s, his clerical collar slightly askew, and his expression that of one who carried too many people's troubles and too few of his own. "Miss Marple," he said warmly, "what a pleasure. Please forgive the disarray. The events of the week have rather unsettled the parish." "I should think so," said Miss Marple kindly. "Death is always unsettling, but murder is positively unseemly." He gave a small, rueful smile. You put it very plainly. I've found it better than putting it prettily, Miss Marple replied. The truth rarely thanks us for flowers. He poured her a cup of tea, his hands faintly trembling. She noticed the same tidy script on the label of his tea tin, the same careful loops and slanted lines she had seen on the note from the greenhouse. You were at the luncheon, were you not, Reverend? She asked gently. I was. A dreadful affair. Yes. You sat beside Lady Fortescue. I did. The Colonel was directly opposite me. I still cannot understand how such a thing could happen under her roof. Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. Did you know Colonel Archer well? Well enough to avoid him, he said with unexpected dryness. He was formidable, a man used to being obeyed, but he was a regular communicant, for all that. And you forgave him many things, perhaps? The vicar's face changed. Forgiveness, he said softly, is a duty, not an indulgence, though I cannot say it is always easy to perform. Miss Marple looked at him over her teacup. Difficulties in forgiveness, she said, often suggest a personal injury. Did he ever wrong you? He hesitated. Not me directly, but he stopped. It's a small village, Miss Marple. People's pasts are rarely private. She waited. Silence had always been her most reliable ally. At last he sighed and continued. There was a young woman, years ago, before I took orders. Her name was Margaret Vale. We were fond of each other, but she broke it off. Later she married Colonel Archer. Ah, said Miss Marple softly, and now she's Mrs. Vale, the companion to Lady Fortescue. Yes, he said, coloring faintly. Margaret returned here after her husband's death. I was glad, and yet, in a way, uneasy. You see, Colonel Archer never forgave her for leaving him, and when she began to assist Lady Fortescue, he used every opportunity to humiliate her publicly. It was cruel, unchristian. People rarely notice how much cruelty hides behind good manners, Miss Marple murmured. Did you ever speak to him about it? I did. The morning of the luncheon, in fact. I told him that if he could not treat her with decency, he ought to avoid her altogether. He laughed in my face and called me a fool. Miss Marple nodded, as if this were entirely predictable. So you wrote him a note, she said calmly. The vicar froze. A note? Yes, asking him to meet you in the library after luncheon. To speak privately, I imagine. He stared at her, all color draining from his face. How could you possibly know that? I found it, she said simply. Dropped near the greenhouse last night. It seemed untidy to leave it there. He sank into his chair, covering his eyes with one hand. Yes, I wrote it. I meant only to appeal to his conscience once more. But when I reached the library after the meal, he was already dead. Miss Marple said nothing. The clock ticked quietly in the corner, counting out the seconds with merciless regularity. I burned the draft, the vicar said at last. I feared it would be misunderstood. But I did not harm him, Miss Marple. I swear it. I believe you, said Miss Marple gently. You're not a man who kills with poison. Your weapon is words, and like all clergymen, you prefer to wound unintentionally. He looked at her with sudden, grateful exhaustion. Then you think it was someone else? I think, she said thoughtfully, that Colonel Archer had a genius for inviting retribution. And one must remember, reverend people do not always kill the one they hate. Sometimes they kill the one who threatens what they love. She stood, setting down her empty cup. Thank you for the tea. I shall say nothing of your letter to Inspector Reeves. unless I must." He rose hastily. "You are very kind." "Not kind," Miss Marple corrected. "Merely practical. Truth, like a seed, must be planted in the right soil. Otherwise it does more harm than good." Outside, the mist had lifted, revealing a sky of pale blue and drifting clouds. Miss Marple walked back toward the hall, her steps steady, her mind busy. The vicar's letter had been innocent, but it proved something vital, that the colonel's death had been expected, even anticipated, by more than one person. At the gate, she paused. Across the lane, Mrs. Vale was walking toward the church, her figure slim and graceful despite her widow's black. Miss Marple observed her for a moment. There was sorrow in her face, but also a kind of relief, the look of someone released from a long captivity. When their paths met, Mrs. Vale greeted her warmly. "Miss Marple, I was just going to the church to pray for the colonel's soul. Poor man." "Quite right, my dear," said Miss Marple gently. "Souls in need of prayer are usually the most troublesome." Mrs. Vale smiled faintly. "It's strange, isn't it? One feels pity only after death. While he lived, I couldn't find it in me to forgive him. And now, she said softly, "I think I almost can." Miss Marple studied her face. It was calm to calm, the kind of calm that doesn't come from forgiveness, but from finality. When she reached the hall again, Inspector Reeves was waiting in the drive, looking harried. "You've been out walking," he said. "Good. Maybe you can tell me something that makes sense. I've just had the post-mortem report. The poison was in the port glass alone, not the decanter." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Ah, then we are making progress." "You think so?" he asked, baffled. "Oh, certainly," she said, her eyes bright with quiet certainty. "We've gone from opportunity to intention. And once one knows intention, the hand is never far behind." She went past him into the house, leaving him frowning in the gravel drive. In her room, she took out the folded note once more and looked at the neat, steady handwriting. Then she placed it beside a letter of Lady Fortescue's she had borrowed earlier that morning. The resemblance was faint, but enough to suggest that Mrs. Vale's delicate script had once been copied from her employer's. Miss Marple sighed softly. "The same house," she murmured, "the same habits, and perhaps the same glass." Outside, the church bell began to ring, slow and solemn. Brindleford was preparing for the inquest, and the village, in its quiet way, was beginning to suspect that truth was not so simple or so distant as they had hoped. Chapter 5. The Inquest. The day of the inquest dawned pale and windless, the kind of English morning that seems to hold its breath. A mist hung over the churchyard, wrapping the headstones in gauze, and the bell tolled one slow, heavy, and slow before falling silent again. In the small hall adjoining the vicarage, the chairs had been set in tidy rows, and the villagers of Brindleford, driven by equal measures of fear and curiosity, had begun to gather long before the coroner's arrival. Miss Marple sat quietly near the back, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression mild. She had attended many such proceedings in her life. She knew their rhythm, the whispered greetings, the polite shuffling, the self-conscious solemnity that always gave way to gossip once the formality was done. To Miss Marple, an inquest was a mirror. It showed not the truth, but the faces of those who wished to hide it. Lady Fortescue arrived last, as though even grief must observe decorum. She wore black velvet, her head held high, her face pale but composed. Charlotte followed her, looking smaller and more frightened than ever. Mrs. Vale was there too. In modest mourning, her gloved hands folded around a prayer book she never opened. Mrs. Cummings sat at the far end, stiff and defiant, as if daring anyone to accuse her outright. Inspector Reeves, seated by the coroner, looked unusually tense. He caught Miss Marple's eye and gave her a faint, weary nod. She smiled back, as though to remind him that patience, like knitting, produced its pattern only by repetition. The coroner, a grave man with kind eyes, called the gathering to order. His questions were calm and deliberate, the sort that demanded detail rather than emotion. The doctor spoke first, confirming the cause of death. Poisoning, swift and undeniable. There had been no error, no accident. It was murder. A soft murmur ran through the room. Miss Marple observed how Lady Fortescue's fingers tightened on her handkerchief, how Charlotte's breath came quick and shallow, and how Mrs. Vale sat perfectly still, as though carved from restraint. Then the coroner called for Mr. Forbes, the butler. His testimony was careful, every word chosen with the caution of a man who has spent his life serving the powerful. I poured the port, he said, and placed the glasses before the gentleman. The colonel objected to his, and exchanged it with Miss Fortescue's. I saw no one touch the glasses afterward. Did you notice anything unusual? No, sir, except perhaps the housekeeper. She seemed unsettled, shaking a bit. A ripple passed through the crowd. Mrs. Cummings's mouth tightened, but she said nothing. The coroner nodded. Thank you, Mr. Forbes. You may step down. Mrs. Cummings was called next. She rose stiffly, walked to the front, and gave her account in a low, trembling voice. I was in the pantry. I didn't go near the port. The colonel never liked me near the table, said I looked too sour for company. I only fetched the napkins. Were you aware of the colonel's condition? No, sir. He looked well enough when I saw him. Too well, if I may say so. Did you have any quarrel with the deceased? Mrs. Cummings drew herself up. No quarrel, but I hated him. Everyone knew that. I told him once he'd pay for what he did to my boy, but I didn't mean it that way. A few gasps came from the crowd. The coroner raised a hand for silence. Thank you, Mrs. Cummings. That will do. As she returned to her seat, Miss Marple noticed that Mrs. Vale leaned slightly forward, her face pale, her gloved hands trembling almost imperceptibly. Then the coroner called Mrs. Vale herself. She walked to the front slowly, gracefully, her eyes lowered. You were present at the luncheon? Yes, she said quietly. Did you observe anything unusual? Mrs. Vale hesitated. Only that Colonel Archer seemed uneasy. He drank more than usual. I remember because I poured him a glass myself earlier, before the meal began. Inspector Reeves sat upright. Before the meal, you say? Yes, he asked for port in the drawing room. I fetched it from the sideboard, poured it into his glass, and he drank half. He said it tasted bitter, but I thought nothing of it. I wiped the rim with my handkerchief before taking the glass to the dining room. There was a sudden, almost tangible stillness. Lady Fortescue's fan slipped from her hand. The coroner's eyes sharpened. You wiped the rim? Yes, Mrs. Vale said softly. The colonel disliked fingerprints on his glass. Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes bright. It was a small detail, but it glittered with meaning. The coroner nodded gravely. Thank you, Mrs. Vale. When she had returned to her seat, Charlotte was called. Her voice shook as she repeated what she had told the inspector, that the colonel had taken her glass instead of his own, that she had noticed nothing unusual, and that she had never tasted the port herself. The coroner asked one final question. Did you have any reason to wish your uncle harm? Charlotte's eyes filled with tears. "No, sir, I only wished he would let me live my life. But I didn't hate him. I was afraid of him." Miss Marple believed her. Fear left a different mark than hatred. It hollowed rather than burned. The inquest concluded an hour later. The coroner gave his verdict in the careful phrasing the law required. Death by strychnine poisoning, administered. At the wooden floor, Reeves approached, rubbing his forehead. "Well, Miss Marple," he said gloomily, "I suppose you found that enlightening." "I didn't. Half the village could have done it." She smiled faintly. "Oh, I found it most enlightening, Inspector. It confirmed exactly what I thought." "And what's that?" "That the poison wasn't meant for the Colonel at all." Reeves frowned. "Not meant for him, but he drank it." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "By mistake. He took the wrong glass, remember? And whoever prepared the right one never expected him to die at all. Which makes this—" She paused delicately. "Not a crime of malice, but of desperation." Reeves stared. "You're saying someone meant to kill someone else?" "Oh no," Miss Marple corrected gently. "I think someone meant only to frighten. But fear, like poison, can be dreadfully mismeasured." He looked at her in disbelief. "You actually think the killer didn't mean it?" "I think," she said, rising, "that human beings are rarely as tidy as their crimes. And if I were you, Inspector, I should ask Mrs. Vale what she wiped from that glass before luncheon and—" "Why?" She gave him a small, knowing smile and walked toward the door. Outside, the church bell began to toll again, its sound carrying across the fields. Miss Marple paused, listening. The air smelled of rain and roses and faintly of truths not yet spoken, but waiting patiently, as truth always did. Chapter 6. The Letter in the Library. The rain began at dawn, soft at first, then steady, drumming on the windows of Brindleford Hall like a patient reminder that even the grandest houses could not keep out the weather. Miss Marple sat at the breakfast table, knitting quietly while Lady Fortescue read her correspondence with a frown that deepened by the minute. "I do wish," Lady Fortescue said sharply, "that people would stop sending condolences. They make it sound as if I were somehow responsible for the man's death." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said mildly, "they mean only to be polite." "Politeness," Lady Fortescue declared, "is a form of intrusion." Miss Marple smiled. "So is sympathy, sometimes, but it can be one moment." She counted another row of stitches before adding, "Has the inspector called this morning?" "Not yet. Thank heaven. He asked yesterday to examine my late husband's papers in the library. I refused, of course. One must draw a line somewhere." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Lines are useful, my dear. They show us where people prefer not to look." Lady Fortescue folded her letters with a sigh. "If you mean to imply that I'm hiding something, you are quite mistaken." "My dear Lady Fortescue," said Miss Marple pleasantly, "I never imply. I merely notice." When the butler entered to remove the tray, he handed Miss Marple a small sealed envelope, delivered by hand. "Ma'am, no name on it." She opened it after Lady Fortescue left the room. Inside was a single line written in a hurried but elegant hand. "Please come to the library at noon. There is something you must see before the inspector does. M.V." Miss Marple read it twice, folded it neatly, and slipped it into her reticule. She murmured, "A confession, or a plea. The distinction is usually one of timing." At noon she made her way to the library. The fire burned low. The heavy curtains muffled the sound of the rain. Books lined the walls in solemn ranks, the scent of old leather mixing with the faint bitterness of smoke. Mrs. Vale stood near the writing desk, pale but composed, her gloved hands resting on a small pile of letters bound with a blue ribbon. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly. "I know I should go to the police, but well, you see things others don't. I thought you might understand." "I shall try," Miss Marple replied gently. "What have you found?" Mrs. Vale hesitated, then untied the ribbon and handed her the top letter. The paper was yellowed, the handwriting unmistakably that of Colonel Archer. "My dear Margaret, you may think me cruel, but you left me no choice. I shall tell Lady Fortescue everything about the debts, the affair, and the child. You'll find neither peace nor position when I'm through. A man must defend his name, even against a woman who once bore it." Miss Marple read it slowly, then looked up. "A child." Mrs. Vale's composure wavered. "Yes, a daughter. She was born before I married Colonel Archer, after he forced my hand. The child was taken away to be raised elsewhere. Lady Fortescue arranged it all. She said it was for the best." "Ah," said Miss Marple softly. "And this daughter?" "She grew up believing she was Lady Fortescue's niece, Charlotte." Miss Marple did not move, only her eyes softened. "Then the Colonel knew. He found out somehow," Mrs. Vale whispered. "He threatened to tell her to ruin her, ruin us both. That morning, before the luncheon, he said it was time the truth came out. And so," Miss Marple said gently, "you poured him a drink that tasted bitter." Mrs. Vale covered her face. "Yes, I did, but it was only meant to frighten him. I used a few drops from a medicine bottle, digitalis, the doctor had prescribed for my heart. I thought it would make him ill, nothing more. I wanted to stop him, only that. But he didn't even finish the glass." Miss Marple nodded. "And later he took the wrong one." Mrs. Vale's eyes filled with tears. "It wasn't his glass, Miss Marple, it was Charlotte's. I thought I'd emptied it, but I hadn't. When he switched them, oh, God forgive me." Miss Marple laid a hand gently on hers. "You didn't mean to kill him. You only meant to protect the child you loved." Mrs. Vale's voice broke. "What will happen to her now, if the truth comes out?" "The truth," said Miss Marple softly, "has a way of shaping itself according to who tells it. Sometimes kindness requires discretion." She turned the letter over thoughtfully. "Why show me this?" "Because," said Mrs. Vale, "I can't destroy it, and yet I cannot bear to keep it." Miss Marple considered a moment, then said, "Let me hold it for now. There may come a time when the inspector should see it, but not yet." Mrs. Vale nodded gratefully, gathered the remaining letters, and slipped away as quietly as she had come. Miss Marple stood for a while, gazing into the fire. The pattern was beginning to form, like a design emerging from her knitting. The Colonel's cruelty, Mrs. Vale's desperation, Charlotte's fear, each thread tangled with the next. Yet one question remained. How much did Lady Fortescue know? Her pride was formidable, but pride often hid its own sins. She was still pondering this when Inspector Reeves entered. His hat and coat were damp, his manner brisk. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple. I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but Lady Fortescue tells me you've taken quite an interest in this case." "Only as a student of human nature, Inspector." He smiled faintly. "Human nature's a tricky subject. I've just been to Exeter. The Colonel's lawyer had some curious amendments to his will. Seems he intended to leave most of his estate, not to Lady Fortescue, but to Miss Charlotte." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "How very generous, and unusual, indeed. Makes you wonder what he was making up for." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. And to whom? Reeves shrugged. Anyway, it gives the girl motive. I'll have to speak to her again. Miss Marple's voice was calm. You might, Inspector, but I'd be careful. Innocence and ignorance are often mistaken for the same thing. He looked puzzled. You're hinting at something, Miss Marple. Oh no, she said lightly. Only that I've known many young women who've inherited more guilt than fortune. Reeves sighed. You always make me feel like a schoolboy who's missed the obvious. That's because you think in facts, Inspector. I think in habits. He frowned. Habits. Yes. People's habits of love, of fear, of silence. They're far more revealing than fingerprints. She smiled, then added casually, by the way, when you speak to Lady Fortescue, ask whether she remembers a child being sent away many years ago, around the time Mrs. Vale entered her service. I fancy the answer will surprise even you. Reeves stared at her. A child? What on earth has that to do with poison? Everything, Miss Marple said simply. Because sometimes a murder begins not with hatred, but with a secret kept too long. She picked up her knitting bag and nodded toward the window. And now, Inspector, I should take a walk before the rain ends. Clarity, I've found, requires fresh air. He watched her go, baffled, as she moved out into the gray drizzle, her small figure disappearing down the path like a ghost of common sense. Inside her pocket, the letter rustled faintly, a secret folded between wool and conscience, waiting for the moment when truth could be told without cruelty. Chapter 7. The Second Death. The rain had stopped by morning, but the air was heavy and cold, as though the village itself held its breath. A strange hush had settled over Brindleford Hall. The servants moved about quietly, speaking in whispers, and even Lady Fortescue seemed subdued. Sitting by the fire in her morning room, her hands folded, her mind elsewhere. Miss Marple took her tea in silence, knitting laid aside. She had slept little. All night her thoughts had turned over and over, the letter from Mrs. Vale resting beneath her pillow like a small but restless truth. At 10:30, a footman entered with a grave face. "Ma'am," he said to Lady Fortescue, "Mrs. Vale has not come down this morning. Her door is locked from within. Cook says there's no answer." Lady Fortescue rose sharply. "Nonsense. She's probably resting. She's been quite nervous lately." "I'll go," said Miss Marple quietly, already standing. A few minutes later, they were outside Mrs. Vale's door. Miss Marple knocked gently, then again. There was no sound. She glanced at the footman. "Fetch the house key, please." When the door was opened, a chill draught met them. The curtains were drawn, the air faintly scented with lavender, and something else, sharper, unmistakable. On the writing desk sat an overturned bottle, its label blurred by spilt liquid. Mrs. Vale lay on the bed, perfectly still, her hands folded as though in prayer. Lady Fortescue gasped. "Oh, good heavens!" Miss Marple moved forward, touched the woman's wrist, and shook her head. "Too late," she said softly. "She's gone." The inspector arrived within the hour. By then, the body had been moved to the guest chamber, and the house was in chaos. Charlotte was weeping, Lady Fortescue pacing, the servants whispering of curses and retribution. Reeves looked tired, his face drawn. "Suicide," he said grimly. "Same poison. Digitalis." The doctor found the bottle on the table. It seemed she couldn't live with what she'd done. Miss Marple said nothing. She was standing by the window, looking out at the gray lawns. "Perhaps," she murmured. Or perhaps she could not live with what she feared might be done next. Reeves frowned. What's that supposed to mean? Guilt, Miss Marple said, is a very convenient explanation, Inspector. But convenience rarely equals truth. He sighed. You think someone else did this too? I think, she said gently, that Mrs. Vale had begun to remember more than she meant to forget. The funeral was held 2 days later, a small, quiet affair. The villagers came out in respectful silence. Miss Marple stood among them, her gloved hands folded, watching Charlotte, pale and trembling beside Lady Fortescue. When the coffin was lowered, a gust of wind scattered the leaves across the grave like a benediction. As they walked back toward the hall, Lady Fortescue said, "Poor Margaret. She was always fragile. I suppose this dreadful business was too much for her." Miss Marple looked at her thoughtfully. "You were fond of her, I think." Lady Fortescue hesitated. "Yes, in my way. She was loyal, she knew when to hold her tongue. That is a rare quality in a servant." "Yes," said Miss Marple quietly, "and in a mother." Lady Fortescue stopped. "I beg your pardon." Miss Marple met her eyes. "You knew, didn't you, that Charlotte was Margaret's child?" The older woman's face went rigid. "That is a monstrous suggestion." "No, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly. "It's a merciful one. You gave that child a home, a name, a place in the world. You wanted to protect her, not disgrace her mother. But the Colonel found out, and that knowledge became his weapon." Lady Fortescue's color drained. "How could you possibly?" "Because," Miss Marple said gently, "I've seen the look you give Charlotte, pride and fear mixed together. It is the look of one who guards a secret too tender to be spoken aloud." For a long moment, Lady Fortescue said nothing. Then she turned away. "If what you say were true," she said slowly, "then I suppose I only did what seemed kind at the time. Margaret had been deceived and abandoned. I couldn't bear to see the child suffer for another's sin. And yet," Miss Marple said softly, "such kindness often comes at the cost of truth. Secrets protect, but they also bind." Lady Fortescue's eyes filled, but she said nothing more. That evening Miss Marple sat in the library again. The house was unnaturally still. She had the letters from Mrs. Vale laid before her, the Colonel's threats, the mother's pleas, the evidence of a love long ruined by pride. She read them slowly, then placed them back into their envelope. Charlotte entered quietly, her face pale. "Lady Fortescue says you wanted to see me." "Yes, my dear," Miss Marple said. "Sit down. You've had a terrible shock." "I keep thinking about Mrs. Vale," Charlotte whispered. "She was so kind to me. I don't understand why she would do such a thing." Miss Marple studied her gently. "She loved you, Charlotte. That's the simplest and saddest reason in the world." Charlotte frowned. "Loved me. But she wasn't. She was just." Miss Marple's voice was calm. "She was your mother." The girl stared at her. "My what?" Miss Marple reached out, taking her trembling hands. "It's true. Lady took you in when you were a baby. Mrs. Vale never told you because she thought it would bring shame. But she loved you more than she dared show." Charlotte's eyes filled with tears. "And she killed herself because of me." "No, my dear," Miss Marple said softly. "Because of guilt and fear. Two poisons far deadlier than digitalis." Charlotte wept silently. Miss Marple held her hand until the tears subsided, then said, "Listen to me, child. Whatever has happened, your life isn't ruined. But you must be brave now. There is something still hidden, something that killed not only your uncle but your mother as well." Charlotte looked up, frightened. "You mean someone else?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes. someone who feared the truth as much as they feared disgrace. And I think," she added gently, "that person lives still under this roof." Later that night, Miss Marple stood in the corridor outside Lady Fortescue's study. The door was slightly ajar. A low murmur came from within. She paused, listening. "She was a fool," Lady Fortescue was saying, "to keep those letters. I told her they'd destroy us all." Another voice answered the vicar's, low and troubled. "You should have let her tell the truth, Eleanor. Secrets have a way of demanding payment." "Payment?" Lady Fortescue's voice rose. "Do you think I care for myself? It's Charlotte I've tried to protect. You know what the village would say? If they knew what Margaret was to her, they'd forgive it more easily than murder," the vicar said quietly. There was silence, then the sound of a sob, quickly stifled. Miss Marple withdrew silently. Her heart was heavy. She knew now that Lady Fortescue had not only known of the child's birth, she had helped conceal it, perhaps even encouraged the act that led to murder. But pity, not anger, filled Miss Marple's mind. The older woman's pride had. Then she blew out the candle and sat for a long time in darkness, her thoughts forming the outline of a plan, gentle, decisive, and final. The web was almost complete. Tomorrow, she told herself, would bring revelation. Chapter 8. The Unraveling Truth. By morning, Brindleford Hall had the strained quiet of a household pretending at peace. The rain had passed, leaving the lawns washed and shining, but beneath the brightness, the atmosphere was heavy. Like a stage after the curtain has fallen, where the actors still wear their masks, because no one dares remove them first. Miss Marple came down early to breakfast, neat and serene as ever. Lady Fortescue, dressed in immaculate grey, was already at the table, her movements brisk, her face pale but composed. Charlotte entered a few moments later, her eyes shadowed but dry. The vicar arrived soon after, offering polite condolences to everyone but looking as though he carried the weight of 2 confessions instead of 1. No one spoke of Mrs. Vale. Her absence sat at the table like an invisible guest. "Inspector Reeves has asked to see us all again this afternoon," Lady Fortescue said, buttering her toast without appetite. "He seems determined to drag this dreadful matter through the mud. Truth," Miss Marple said mildly, "has a habit of surviving the mud. It simply waits until it's clean enough to be seen." Lady Fortescue gave a faint, brittle laugh. "I wish you wouldn't talk like a sermon, Miss Marple. You sound like Henry." "Then you should listen to him," Miss Marple replied pleasantly. "He's quite right about the dangers of concealment." The vicar looked up quickly, color rising to his cheeks, but said nothing. After breakfast, Miss Marple took a slow turn through the gardens. The morning was fresh, and the air smelled faintly of wet earth and roses. The trees whispered gently in the breeze, as if gossiping among themselves. She paused near the greenhouse, where the first letter had been found, and smiled faintly at the memory. Inspector Reeves found her there not long after, his notebook in hand, looking slightly harried. "Morning, Miss Marple. You seem to have the gift of being where things happen." "Observation, Inspector. The same gift is yours, though I prefer knitting needles to notebooks." He smiled briefly. "I'll trade you, if it'll help me make sense of this case. I've been over Mrs. Vale's room again. Suicide still fits. Everything points to it." "Everything," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully, "except motive. She feared exposure, yes, but not enough to die. Fear of disgrace is a cold thing, Inspector. It paralyzes, but it rarely kills." Reeves sighed. "If she didn't take the poison herself, then someone gave it to her. But why?" She'd already confessed to poisoning the Colonel. Ah, said Miss Marple softly, but not everyone wanted that confession heard. The inspector frowned. You're suggesting she was silenced. I'm suggesting, she said gently, that guilt is not always distributed evenly among the living, and that sometimes a second death is a kind of insurance. Reeves looked at her sharply. You think someone close to her did it? Miss Marple turned to face the hall, the morning light glinting off its windows. Oh yes, Inspector. Very close indeed. That afternoon, the drawing-room at Brindleford Hall was arranged with all the quiet formality of a small inquisition. Reeves sat by the hearth, his notebook ready. Lady Fortescue took her usual chair near the fire, Charlotte beside her, pale and watchful. The vicar stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back. Miss Marple sat unobtrusively near the sideboard, knitting in her lap but her eyes alert. Reeves began briskly. I've called you all here because new evidence has come to light concerning Mrs. Vale's death and that of Colonel Archer. Lady Fortescue lifted her chin. Then I trust this will put an end to the rumors. I hope so, Reeves said evenly. We've established that Mrs. Vale poured the Colonel a drink before luncheon. That's confirmed. But the poison itself. Digitalis was found not only in that glass, but also in the small medicine bottle from Mrs. Vale's room. The label's been tampered with. Charlotte's voice trembled. Then she really did do it. Reeves hesitated. That's the question. There's a thumbprint on the bottle, not hers. The silence that followed was thick as smoke. Lady Fortescue's hands froze on the armrest. The vicar's face went white. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. Who's Inspector? Lady Fortescue's, Reeves said quietly. Charlotte gave a small cry. Aunt Ilianohan. Lady Fortescue stood, her voice cutting the air like glass. This is absurd. That bottle must have passed through a dozen hands. I cared for Margaret. I tried to help her. Why would I harm her? Miss Marple's voice was calm. Because, my dear, you thought she might ruin everything you had done to protect Charlotte. Lady Fortescue turned sharply. You presume far too much. I presume nothing, Miss Marple said gently. I observe. And I've observed how pride behaves when it's cornered. You told Mrs. Vale to keep quiet, didn't you? You warned her that if she revealed Charlotte's parentage, she'd destroy the girl's future. But she couldn't bear the guilt of the Colonel's death and meant to confess. You met her that night, tried to persuade her to hold her peace. And when she refused, well, it must have seemed like mercy to help her find rest. Lady Fortescue's breath came short. You dare accuse me of murder? Reeves stepped forward. But Miss Marple's calm voice held the room. No, my dear. I accuse you of love misguided, desperate love. You've lived your life by appearances, by what the world might think. You believed you were saving Charlotte, when in truth you were only saving your pride. Charlotte rose suddenly. Aunt Eleanor, is it true? Did you? Lady Fortescue's lips trembled. For a moment she said nothing. Then her shoulders sagged. I only wanted to keep her safe, she whispered. Everything I ever did was for her. When Margaret came to me with that child, I took her in. I gave her my name, my protection, and now her voice broke. Now it's all for nothing. Charlotte went to her, kneeling at her feet. No, Aunt, it isn't nothing. I love you for it, but you should have trusted me with the truth. Miss Marple rose quietly, her knitting set aside. Truth, she said softly, is like a child. It must be cared for early, or it grows up wild. Reeves closed his notebook slowly. Lady Fortescue, I'll have to take your statement. You'll be treated with every consideration." The older woman straightened. "Do what you must, Inspector. My life has been one long performance. I suppose it's fitting that the curtain falls in public." Charlotte wept silently. The vicar stood with bowed head, murmuring a prayer under his breath. Miss Marple watched them all with a sadness that was almost tenderness. There was no triumph in her, only the quiet certainty that comes from understanding the frailty of good intentions. Later, when the house had emptied and evening shadows lengthened across the lawns, Miss Marple walked alone through the gardens. The air was still, the last of the daylight fading behind the trees. She paused near the greenhouse and looked back at the great house, its windows glowing faintly against the dusk. So much sorrow, she thought, had begun with kindness, the kind that hides, that silences, that fears, and now 2 lives had paid the price for it. As she turned toward the gate, she murmured to herself, "The wicked seldom set out to be wicked. They only forget that truth, once buried, grows like ivy quietly, persistently, until it cracks the stone." The church bell tolled in the distance. Miss Marple smiled faintly and drew her shawl tighter around her shoulders. There would be another inquiry, another round of polite explanations, but the story itself was finished. Brindleford Hall, she knew, would soon be quiet again, outwardly, at least. And as she walked back toward the vicarage light, her figure small against the deepening dusk, she thought, not without pity, of Lady Fortescue's last words. "I only wanted to keep her safe." Miss Marple sighed. "Ah, yes," she whispered, "and that, in the end, is what makes so many tragedies respectable." Chapter 9. The Aftermath. A week passed before Brindleford regained its rhythm, or rather, a pale imitation of it. The villagers still spoke in lowered voices, doors closed earlier in the evening, and the postmistress claimed that the air itself felt different. In truth, it was not the weather that had changed, but the moral temperature of the place. Scandal leaves a chill no hearth can easily warm away. Lady Fortescue was no longer at the hall. Inspector Reeves had taken her statement and escorted her to Exeter, where she awaited the coroner's inquiry. Though officially she was not charged, the implication was clear enough. In small villages, guilt does not require a verdict, only an audience. Charlotte remained behind, pale and bewildered, presiding over a house that no longer felt like hers. The servants moved with the uneasy sympathy of those who both pity and fear their mistress. The vicar came daily to pray with her, and sometimes Miss Marple would join them, her presence calm and quiet, like a small candle in a dark room. "I keep thinking," Charlotte said one afternoon as they sat in the morning room, "that if Aunt Eleanor hadn't tried so hard to protect me, none of this would have happened." Miss Marple smiled sadly. "Yes, my dear, but one must remember, love often chooses the wrong weapons. Pride is simply love without humility." Charlotte looked out toward the gardens, her voice trembling. "She meant no harm." "No," Miss Marple said softly, "but meaning well can be dangerous when one refuses to see clearly. Most crimes, in my experience, begin with someone trying to spare someone else pain." The girl's eyes filled with tears. "And Mrs. Vale, my mother, she died because of that too." Miss Marple reached across and took her hand. "Your mother died trying to protect you from shame. Lady Fortescue acted for the same reason. It was their misfortune that their motives opposed one another." They sat in silence for a moment. The clock ticked gently on the mantelpiece, marking the slow passage of a peace that was not yet peace at all. In the village, gossip rippled like wind through the hedgerows. At the bakery, Mrs. Partridge declared that Lady Fortescue had been a proud woman, and pride always has its price. At the post office, Mr. Huggins swore she'd get off lightly. The gentry always do. The vicar's wife, more charitable, said only that she prayed for the poor soul's deliverance, in every sense. Inspector Reeves stopped by Miss Marple's lodgings 2 days later. He looked worn but not unkindly resigned. "Well," he said, "the coroner's done with it. The verdict was manslaughter, with extenuating circumstances. She'll be released soon. The doctors say her health is failing anyway." Miss Marple nodded. "It was never justice she needed, Inspector, only understanding." Reeves rubbed the back of his neck. "You know, I can't quite get over how you saw it all so plainly. The rest of us were chasing poisons and alibis, and you were sitting there with your knitting, seeing straight through the lot." Miss Marple smiled. "It's much the same thing, really. One only has to notice where the pattern breaks." He chuckled. "Well, I'll leave the patterns to you. I'm off to Exeter tomorrow, but I dare say I'll miss our little village dramas." "Oh, I don't think Brindleford's done with drama," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling. "Villages are simply theaters without curtains. The performances change, but the characters remain much the same." Reeves laughed softly, tipped his hat, and left her with that thought. A few evenings later, Miss Marple was invited to tea at the vicarage. The vicar, though visibly aged by recent events, had recovered some of his gentle good humor. "I sometimes think, Miss Marple," he said, as he poured her tea, "that Providence works through the most extraordinary means." "Indeed it does," she replied, "though I doubt it always means to be thanked for it." He smiled. "You speak like Job." "I hope with fewer boils," Miss Marple said lightly, and the vicar laughed for the first time in days. After tea, they walked together through the churchyard. The setting sun painted the headstones with soft gold. At the far end lay the graves of Colonel Archer and Mrs. Vale, one marked with cold grandeur, the other simple and without flourish. Miss Marple paused before them both. "They lie close," the vicar said quietly. "It seems ironic." "Not ironic," Miss Marple murmured, "appropriate. They were bound together in life, pride and pain, cause and consequence. Death merely reconciles what life divides." She looked up at the fading sky. "I wonder sometimes, Reverend, whether God minds how clumsily we imitate his justice." He sighed. "Perhaps he minds less than we do. We judge to punish, he judges to heal." "Then he is wiser than any of us," said Miss Marple. "But I suspect he has less patience with foolish women." The vicar smiled faintly. "And yet it's the foolish who keep his world turning." Charlotte called on Miss Marple the next day, dressed plainly in gray. There was a letter in her hand, sealed but unaddressed. "I'm going away," she said softly. "To London first, then perhaps to France. The hall feels haunted. I can't stay." Miss Marple nodded approvingly. "A change of air is often the best medicine." "I wanted you to have this," Charlotte continued, offering the letter. "It's from Aunt Eleanor. The inspector said I might have it now. She asked that it be given to you." Miss Marple accepted it gravely. "Thank you, my dear. Will you read it?" "No," Charlotte said. "I think I already know what it says." When the girl had gone, Miss Marple broke the seal. The letter was short, written in a trembling hand. "My dear Miss Marple, you have shown me what courage really means. To see the truth and still speak gently of it. I do not ask forgiveness, only understanding. Tell Charlotte that I loved her as my own, for indeed she was both my sin and my salvation. Eleanor Fortescue." Miss Marple read it twice, then folded it carefully. Her eyes were wet, though her lips held the faintest smile. "Ah," she whispered, "at last she's learned humility, that most painful form of grace." That evening she took her customary walk through the village. The lamps were lit, the cottages warm, and from the pub came the faint sound of laughter, fragile, uncertain, but real. Life, as it always did, was knitting itself back together. As she passed the churchyard, she saw the vicar locking the gate. He raised a hand in greeting. "All quiet again, Miss Marple, for the moment," she said. "But villages are like gardens, Reverend. Even when they look peaceful, something is always growing underneath." He smiled, and she continued on her way, the gravel crunching softly beneath her feet. When she reached the inn where she was staying, she paused to look back at the distant outline of Brindleford Hall. Its windows glowed faintly through the mist, golden and far away, a house diminished but not destroyed. In her room, she lit a small lamp, set her knitting on the table, and glanced once more at Lady Fortescue's letter. Then, with a sigh, she slipped it into her book of evening prayers. "Mercy," she murmured, "is simply justice seen from heaven's side." The wind rose softly outside, stirring the ivy at her window. Miss Marple picked up her needles and began to knit, her hands steady, her mind at peace. The village slept on, unaware that it owed its uneasy calm to a small, silver-haired woman who had once again restored balance, not by force, but by understanding. Chapter 10. Home to St. Mary Mead. The train pulled out of Brindleford station beneath a low pewter sky. Fields blurred past hedgerows, bare orchards, and the occasional cottage smoking faintly in the damp. Miss Marple sat by the window, hands folded neatly in her lap, her small traveling case at her feet. The compartment smelled faintly of coal dust and chrysanthemums. For the first half-hour she simply watched the countryside slip away, feeling, as she often did after a case, a kind of wistful quiet. Not satisfaction exactly, but something gentler. The pattern had resolved itself, the knots untangled. Yet every thread was still human, and that meant sorrow was never fully removed. When the train slowed near the junction, she opened her reticule and took out Lady Fortescue's letter. The paper had softened at the creases from being read too often. She read it once more, then tucked it away and looked out again at the grey hills rolling by. "Such a pity," she murmured. "So much pride wasted on protecting love." The guard passed through the carriage, tipping his cap. "Change for Paddington, miss." "No, thank you," said Miss Marple. "I'm for St. Mary Mead." He smiled kindly. "Ah, quiet little place, that. Not much happens there, I reckon." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. One might be surprised. By the time she reached St. Mary Mead, the sun had broken through a weak but cheerful light, turning the church spire pale gold. Familiar faces greeted her as she made her way from the station. Mr. Foote, the grocer, Miss Weatherby, from the post office, and young Tom Ellison riding his bicycle too fast for decency, all exactly as before, which was comforting. Her cottage on Old Mill Lane looked the same as ever, whitewashed walls, tidy garden, and the brass knocker polished to within an inch of its life by her daily help, Mrs. Hart. Inside, the clock ticked faithfully on the mantelpiece, and the faint scent of lavender polish hung in the air. "Oh, it's good to be home," she said aloud, removing her gloves. "Though the world does seem to manage quite well without me." Mrs. Hart arrived within minutes, as if summoned by instinct. "Well, Miss Marple, it's a mercy you're back safe. We've heard all sorts about that business in Devon? Nasty doings, they said. Quite nasty, Miss Marple agreed mildly, settling into her chair. But then, nastiness is only human nature in its Sunday clothes. Mrs. Hart blinked. Oh, you and your sayings. Still, it's nice you're home. Would you like your tea now? Yes, please, said Miss Marple, smiling. Strong, with a little milk. I think I've earned it. That evening, as the fire burned low, Miss Marple sat in her favorite chair by the window, her knitting on her lap. Outside, the lane lay peaceful, a cat darting across the cobbles, a lamp glowing faintly by the church gate. It was hard to believe that only a week ago she had been standing in a house heavy with guilt and secrets. She thought of Charlotte, now gone to London, young, frightened, but perhaps at last free. She imagined her walking along some busy street, learning to live without the weight of a lie on her shoulders, holding an envelope. Post just come, miss. From Devon, by the look of it. Miss Marple took it, adjusting her spectacles. The handwriting was unfamiliar, neat, careful, but youthful. She broke the seal. Dear Miss Marple, I hope you will forgive me for writing. I wanted to thank you not only for saving me from suspicion, but for telling me the truth. I have found work as a governess in London. It isn't grand, but it's honest. I think my mother would. She folded the letter carefully and slipped it into her prayer book beside Lady Fortescue's mother and daughter, she said softly. Both found forgiveness, one in heaven, the other still learning it on earth. The next morning brought a visit from the vicar of St. Mary Mead, a cheerful, portly man who had long since given up trying to understand Miss Marple's adventures, but enjoyed hearing about them all the same. Well, my dear lady, he said, as he settled into the armchair opposite her, I hear you've been setting Devon to rights again. The papers said something about a society woman and a poisoned drink, though of course one mustn't believe everything one reads. Quite right, said Miss Marple, pouring his tea. It's seldom the poison that's the worst of it, you know. It's the motives. So much untidier than chemistry. He chuckled. You do have a way of putting things. But it's a comfort, in a strange sort of way, to think that justice still prevails. Miss Marple smiled. Justice, perhaps, but never without cost. They talked for a while longer about village matters, the state of the church roof, Mrs. Price's new hens, and the scandal of Mrs. Lethbridge's rose competition before the vicar took his leave. When he had gone, Miss Marple sat for a while in silence, her knitting forgotten on her lap. She looked out of the window toward the square of evening sky and thought of Brindleford. Its quiet lanes, its stone church, its secrets now laid to rest. Every village, she murmured, is a small world, and every world, however small, has its Eden and its fall. As dusk deepened, she lit the lamp and began to tidy her writing desk. In one corner lay the last of the case's remnants, the folded letters, tied now with a piece of blue ribbon, the same ribbon Mrs. Vale had once used. For a moment she considered burning them. Then she shook her head. No, she said softly, some things are better preserved, not as evidence, but as warning. She placed them in a drawer beside her old case notes from other villages, other small tragedies disguised as respectability. Then she drew the curtain, made her tea, and returned to her chair. Mysteries. Miss Marple picked up her needles once more and began to knit, each stitch as even and certain as time itself. Chapter 11. A Visitor from Brindleford. It was early spring in St. Mary Mead. The snowdrops had already come and gone, and daffodils now nodded in the hedgerows. The air had that fresh, hopeful chill that makes one believe winter has truly ended, though Miss Marple, with her usual realism, still kept a shawl close at hand. She was sitting by her garden window, knitting a soft yellow scarf for the vicar's new grandchild, when she heard the gate click. A moment later, Mrs. Hart's voice called cheerfully from the hallway. "Visitor for you, Miss from Devon," she says. Miss Marple looked up, a spark of curiosity in her eyes. "From Devon, my word, how interesting." The door opened, and there stood Charlotte Vale, or rather Charlotte Fortescue, no longer. Her face was thinner, but her eyes were calm, her smile unforced. She wore a simple traveling cloak and carried a small bouquet of violets, freshly gathered somewhere along her way. "My dear child," Miss Marple exclaimed, rising. "What a lovely surprise. You're looking much stronger." Charlotte smiled shyly. "I hoped you wouldn't mind me coming. I had a few days' leave from my position, and I wanted to thank you in person properly, this time. Mind, my dear, I'm delighted." "Sit down, do." Miss Marple poured tea, fussed with the biscuits, and insisted Charlotte eat too, before saying another word. When the tea things were settled, Charlotte said softly, "I've been working at a school in Bath, teaching little ones. It's not glamorous, but I like it. They ask such honest questions. It's peaceful." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Peaceful questions are the most dangerous sort. They make one remember truths we'd rather forget. But I'm glad you've found contentment. You've earned it." Charlotte hesitated. "I went to see Aunt Eleanor before she passed away." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Ah, you made your peace then?" "Yes," Charlotte whispered. "She was weak, but her mind was clear. She said she prayed every day that I'd live honestly, even if the world judged me for it. She told me she had loved me as her own because she'd never been brave enough to love openly, and then she asked me to forgive her. I told her I already had." A faint smile touched Miss Marple's lips. "Forgiveness, my dear, is simply love after it has grown wiser." They sat in companionable silence for a time, listening to the faint hum of bees in the garden. A robin perched on the windowsill, cocking its head as though it too were curious about this reunion. Charlotte took a breath. "I wanted you to know something else. After she died, I found a small box among her things. Inside was a photograph of my mother younger, smiling, and a letter she'd written to Lady Fortescue years ago. It said she was grateful that her daughter was safe, and that one day, when the world was kinder, she hoped Charlotte would learn who she truly was." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "And now you have." "Yes," Charlotte said. "It felt like being given back to myself." Miss Marple nodded approvingly. "That's a fine way to put it. Many people spend their whole lives searching for themselves, and you've found it before 30. I call that good fortune." Charlotte's smile trembled. "I owe much of it to you." "Oh, nonsense," said Miss Marple, waving a hand. "I did very little. You did the hardest part. You faced the truth and lived with it." "Still," Charlotte said quietly, "I think you saved me. Not from prison or scandal, but from becoming bitter. You made me see that what matters isn't what people whisper, but what one becomes afterward." Miss Marple reached across and patted her hand. "You see, you're wiser than you were. That's all experience really gives us, wisdom at the cost of pain. A dear exchange, though rarely voluntary." The afternoon sunlight slanted through the lace curtains, warming the room with soft gold. Miss Marple poured another cup of tea and leaned back in her chair. "Tell me," she said, "do you ever think of returning to Brindleford?" Charlotte shook her head. "No. Some places hold too many echoes. I keep the Good memories, the garden, the sound of the clock in the hall. But the rest I leave to time. I'd rather build something new. Quite right, Miss Marple said approvingly. One must prune the past as one does a rosebush, or it grows wild and strangles the new shoots. Charlotte laughed softly. You always have a way of putting things. Well, Miss Marple said, gardening and human nature are much the same. Both need patience and a firm hand. When Charlotte rose to leave, the light had already begun to fade. The robin fluttered off, as if to announce the hour. Miss Marple accompanied her to the gate. The path scented faintly with lilac and rain. Charlotte turned, her expression wistful. I suppose this is goodbye for a long while. Perhaps, said Miss Marple, smiling. But life has a habit of bringing people round again when there's something left unsaid. I'll keep the kettle ready. Charlotte hesitated. May I ask, do you ever regret becoming involved in other people's troubles? Miss Marple thought for a moment. Regret? No. Pity sometimes, but never regret. To see clearly, even when it hurts, is better than to live comfortably in blindness. Charlotte nodded, her eyes glistening. I'll remember that. They embraced briefly but sincerely. And then Charlotte walked away down the lane, her figure small but steady against the mellowing light. Miss Marple stood for a while watching her go, then turned back toward her little house, murmuring to herself, a child of sorrow, now walking toward her own dawn. The world does mend itself, given patience. Inside, the kettle began to whistle softly. Miss Marple smiled, went to pour her tea, and resumed her knitting by the fire. Outside, the church bells of St. Mary Mead began to ring for evening service, calm, certain, and enduring, like the peace that finally rested over them all. Chapter 12. The Village Restored. Spring deepened gently that year. By May, St. Mary Mead was once again a picture of English contentment. Lilac hedges heavy with bloom, bees busy among the daisies, and the air carrying the soft scent of freshly turned soil. To a casual eye, nothing ever changed here. But Miss Marple knew better. Villages, like people, carried their histories quietly, under polite smiles and well-swept paths. She was in her garden that morning, pruning her roses with careful precision. The sky was pale blue, with clouds drifting like slow thoughts. Somewhere nearby, the vicar's wife was scolding her hens, and a milk cart rattled past on the lane. All was peaceful, yet Miss Marple's mind was far away, in a grand house in Devon, with dark panelled rooms, and too many secrets. She thought often of Brindleford, not with sorrow, but with the detached tenderness one reserves for an old photograph. Time had softened the sharp edges of that tragedy, leaving only the lessons about love, fear, and the dangerous ways people try to protect what they love most. When the post arrived, she carried it to the table and sorted through the letters, one from her niece Raymond's wife, another from the local Women's Institute, and a third, addressed in a fine unfamiliar hand. She smiled faintly as she opened it. My dear Miss Marple, you will not know me, but I am Mrs. Wilton, headmistress at the Bath Academy for Girls. Miss Charlotte Vale, as she now calls herself, teaches here, and I wanted you to know what an excellent influence she has become. Her pupils adore her, and her gentleness hides a remarkable strength. She never speaks of her past, but one senses she has endured much and forgiven more. You were her guide, I think. I thought you might like to hear that she is well. With warm regards, Edith Wilton. Miss Marple read the letter twice, her smile deepening. How very nice, she murmured. How perfectly right. She placed it beside the earlier letters. Lady Fortescue's trembling farewell and Charlotte's first note of gratitude. Together they formed a quiet trilogy, guilt, forgiveness, and peace. The 3 stages, she thought, of every moral story worth telling. That afternoon, she walked to the churchyard. The gate creaked softly as she entered. It was not Brindleford's churchyard, of course, but the one here, tidy, sunlit, fragrant with grass and thyme. Yet somehow, standing among those gravestones, she felt close to them all. Lady Fortescue, Mrs. Vale, even poor, foolish Colonel Archer, they had all tried, in their own ways, to command life, and it had quietly refused to obey. She sat on a low bench near the yew tree and folded her hands. "I suppose," she said softly to herself, "that we all have our Brindleford halls, our small kingdoms we try to rule with pride or affection, and sooner or later they fall apart because we forget that people are not possessions." A robin hopped near her feet, bold and curious. She smiled. "You're quite right to remind me, little one. Nature wastes no time on regret." The church bell chimed 4 times, a calm, domestic sound. It reminded her that she had lived long enough to see many such tragedies, and that they all ended, sooner or later, not in grand revelations, but in the slow mending of ordinary lives. When she returned home, the fire was laid and the kettle ready. Mrs. Hart had left a note on the tray, "Out to the shops." Back before tea, Miss Marple settled into her chair by the window, poured herself a cup, and opened her notebook. She had long since given up keeping formal records of her cases, but she liked to jot down thoughts, fragments of truth, as she called them. She wrote carefully in her small, slanting hand. Every crime begins with a secret, but not every secret is a crime. Fear disguises itself as virtue more often than evil does. Love, when mixed with pride, is the most dangerous poison of all. She set down her pen and read the words over. Then, with a small nod, she closed the book and placed it beside the others in the drawer. The quiet archive of a life spent observing human nature in all its peculiar shades. Outside, the sky had begun to turn gold. The last of the sunlight glowed through the ivy, and the lane shimmered faintly in the warmth. Miss Marple watched the light with that inward calm that comes only from understanding, the sort that does not excuse sin, but comprehends it. As evening fell, she took her knitting and moved to the fireside. The gentle click of her needles filled the room. It was a sound of continuity, of patience, of the small, steady acts by which people keep life civilized after chaos. Her thoughts wandered again, not to the murders or the inquiries, but to the moments after, Charlotte kneeling beside her aunt, the vicar's voice trembling over the graves, the scent of violets blooming too early by the church wall. Those were the true endings, she thought, the quiet ones that never make the papers. The clock struck 7. Miss Marple smiled faintly and looked up. "Another day gone," she said, "and the world still full of mysteries, though, thank goodness, not all of them deadly." She reached to draw the curtains, pausing a moment to look out at the peaceful lane. Somewhere far away, in a town filled with children's laughter, Charlotte was teaching her pupils to read, perhaps reciting a poem, perhaps smiling in that shy way of hers. The thought warmed her. "Well," Miss Marple said softly, "perhaps that is justice after all, not the kind handed down in courts, but the quiet balance that life restores when given time." She drew the curtains, turned down the lamp, and settled back into her chair, her knitting in her lap and the steady flame dancing on the hearth. Outside, the night deepened, and the village slept under a sky full of patient stars. And in the little house on Old Mill Lane, the woman who saw truth where others saw gossip closed her eyes for a moment, not in weariness but in peace,